Well, I grew up in Montreal in a modern Orthodox home. My parents were immigrants. My father was from central Ukraine. My mother was born in Bessarabia and came to Canada as a child, as a baby actually. And I attended a Hebrew day school, the Dath Israel Academy, both for elementary and high school. So I had a relatively strong Jewish background, not terribly religious, but strong culturally. I also went to a Hebrew Zionist camp for 10 years, Camp Masad in Montreal, both as a camper and as a counselor. As an adult, I got an English degree at McGill University, and I decided I wanted to go, I wanted to be a folk singer, but that didn't work out. So after trying that, I studied English at McGill and decided to go into filmmaking, and I took a year in an MFA program at Columbia. Eventually I made my first film, a film about the Montreal Jewish poet Abraham Moses Klein. And then I needed a job because my wife was pregnant, we were having twins, and I ended up at CBC working for 18 or 19 years, first at the Journal and then at the Fifth Estate as a producer-director of documentaries and then investigative reports for the Fifth Estate. Anyway, late in my career, I really felt that I wanted to return to something Jewish in my professional life. And I convinced the executive producer of the Fifth Estate at the time, Kelly Crichton, to let me make a film about Jewish child survivors of the Holocaust. I wanted to do it in Canada because one of our hosts on the show, Hannah Gartner, was actually a member of a family that were Holocaust survivors from Czechoslovakia. But she didn't want to do the film, so the executive producer, I asked the executive producer, let me go to Poland to do this. And she said yes. And I was thrilled, and I went to Poland with Lyndon McIntyre in 1992. And we met three very interesting child survivors of the Holocaust. One of them was a graduate of the University in Warsaw who was married to Jerzy Fitzowski, who wrote a very important book of poems about the Holocaust in 1979. He wasn't Jewish, but he was a member of the Polish resistance. Anyway, while doing that film, we ended up one day in a cemetery in a small town outside of Warsaw. I can't remember where it was. It might have been Kazimierz Dolny. And there was a controversy in this small town. They had built a high school, ironically named after Janusz Korczak, who was a psychologist in charge of the orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto, who died tragically in Treblinka with his charges. Anyway, in a high school ironically named after Janusz Korczak, they had dug up a field which was a former Jewish cemetery. They made a soccer field there, and then they wanted to put in a hot water line in the field. And they uncovered bones in this field, and there was a huge controversy over what to do. Should they build the hot water line? What should they do with the bones? We went to this town to cover this controversy as part of our story, and in one corner of the field was a stack of matzevot, Jewish gravestones that had been, I guess, gathered from this former cemetery. And I looked at these gravestones, and I had never seen Jewish gravestones of such beauty. The calligraphy was beautiful, and the artwork at the top of the gravestones was beautiful. And this made a huge impression on me. On the same trip at the airport, I picked up a book by Monika Krajewska, which was the very first book published in Poland about Jewish cemeteries in Poland. It was a book of black and white photographs, and I brought that home and I pored over the book. And between the memories of that high school soccer field and that book, I thought, well, here is a subject that I could actually do. This is a long-term project I could get into, photographing Jewish cemeteries in Poland. And that's where I began. I went back in 2002 to do a feature documentary about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising for the Turning Points in History series for History Television in Canada. And on that trip, I saw the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery in the winter. And it was magnificent. and beautiful. And then in 2007, on my own, I produced and directed a feature documentary about the Lodz ghetto. And I saw the Lodz cemetery. And I was knocked out by both of these cemeteries. They are among the largest Jewish cemeteries in the world, and the most impressive in terms of their memorial art, in terms of the extensiveness of the grounds and the variety, and the historical context they provide to both their communities. So in 2007, while I was making my documentary about the Lodz ghetto, I decided enough time has passed. I'm going to come back here and start a still photography project photographing Jewish cemeteries. So after finishing filming in August 2007, I booked another plane ticket for a month later in September, booking around the Jewish holidays, of course, and I went to Lodz to start my project on photographing and documenting Jewish cemeteries in Poland. Of course, as I explored Lodz, not Warsaw, because in Warsaw there's almost nothing left from before the war. I'll explain in more detail. In Lodz there was almost no fighting, there was no conflict. So almost everything in Lodz that existed before the war still exists today. So these are two stark contrasts, but both of them have intact Jewish cemeteries because in both cities there were very large Jewish ghettos. And the Germans, as hateful as they were about keeping Jewish cemeteries intact, had to have places to bury the tens of thousands of Jews who died in the ghettos from starvation and disease and from violence. So both cemeteries were left intact, continued to function during the war, and today we're blessed by having these two enormous historic Jewish cemeteries. The Lodz Cemetery is the largest by land area in Europe and maybe in the world, 100 hectares. It's very large. It has 180,000 burial sites. The Warsaw Cemetery is somewhat smaller, but has more burial sites, 250,000 burial sites. In each cemetery, of course, there are fewer numbers of monuments or matzevot than the actual number of burial sites. So in Lodz, out of 180,000 burial sites, maybe there are 60 or 70,000 monuments. In Warsaw, somewhat more than that. But they're enormously impressive cemeteries, and in each cemetery, you can decipher and read the history of their respective communities. The other thing about both these cemeteries is that for 50 to 60 years, they were not maintained properly during the Soviet era, after the war during the Soviet era. Even though they continued to function in both throughout those decades, no one cut down the trees or the greenery. So right now, both of those cemeteries have sections that look like forests, and they're really beautiful because of that. Now, in some cases, the greenery is damaging and that has to be cleared away. But in other cases, in other parts of the cemetery, they're like forests where the greenery grows in a somewhat uncontrolled manner, and scattered among the greenery and the trees are these rows of beautifully carved monuments, matzevot, which are, this contradiction provides a wonderful context for the cultural and historical meaning of both these cemeteries. Like every good photographer and documentary filmmaker, you do research. And we're blessed, actually, with something that the American Congress did. The United States Congress has a Department of American Heritage abroad. And they have done studies for different ethnic groups on heritage sites that are in countries of origin of American Jews. So in the early 2000s, they hired a number of competent researchers, sort of anthropologists, and they did complete surveys of heritage sites in Poland, in Ukraine, and a couple of other countries in Western Europe. So you can go online, download these documents, and you can find out where historic cemeteries and synagogues exist throughout Poland and Ukraine, and what condition they're in. It tells you for every cemetery how many monuments remain in the cemetery, what shape they're in, what the condition of the synagogues are in. So using this sort of research and other online tools, every time I made a trip to Poland or to Western Ukraine in 2016 or to the Baltic states also in 2016, I was able to do research ahead of time, know where I was going and know what I would expect to find there. Anyway, so you do a lot of research and then you go and you ask people, and I consulted with people at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. They had some knowledgeable people there and still do. And I consulted with someone who is head of a travel agency named Pauline. He's actually a man who has a PhD. He wrote a thesis on the history of Auschwitz. And I consulted with him on certain sites. And when we went to Ukraine in particular, which is not as tourist friendly as Poland. Poland is in the EU. Very easy to get around, no problem. Ukraine is somewhat more difficult. Not as developed, a poor country, a bit of an overhang of corruption from the Soviet era, not as friendly to Jews, not anti-Semitic, but not as friendly, let's say. In Ukraine, we had a very competent guide who was living in Toronto, was from Ukraine and spent half a year in Lviv with his own tour guiding company, and I hired him and he was wonderful. In Ukraine, far fewer people speak English. That's another issue. In Poland, there are quite a lot of people who speak English. The other difference is this. Every small town we went to in Poland, no matter where we went, we knew approximately where the cemeteries were or the synagogues because I had done research, and you could locate them online on maps. For instance, we'd pull up to a small town and I knew the cemetery was among farmers' fields. We pull into the small town. On the outskirts of town, we see a playground. And there's a single woman in the playground with a small child. We go to the woman, and with our few words of Polish, I knew how to say cemetery and I knew how to say Jewish cmentarz, Judowski. She looks at us, smiles, takes out his cell phone, makes a call, and says, 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, the person in charge of the cemetery pulls up on a bicycle and takes us to the cemetery. And you could do that everywhere in Poland because they welcome Jewish tourists. There are lots of Jewish tourists, both religious and non-religious or secular. And it's a part of the economy, catering to Jewish tourists also. In Ukraine, it was much more difficult. People didn't know, people didn't care. In Ukraine, you really needed a guide, you really needed to make the proper contacts. In Poland, there was only one place where I would say the person who led us into the synagogue was a bit of a negative, suspicious character, apparently really just in it for the money. Everyone else that we met was doing this because they cared about Jewish historical sites in Poland. And 99% of these people were not Jewish, right? We heard, when I was doing my show in '92 on child survivors of the Holocaust, we met a man who was in charge of the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. He later worked full-time for the Jewish Historical Institute. He said to us, you have to understand that for a long time, the preservation of Jewish cemeteries, especially in small towns, not in large cities, but in small towns, was the province, was the work of people who were outsiders in their community. A lot of young gay men in small communities took it on themselves to investigate what was this historic Jewish site in their community, and they became interested, and some of them took steps to protect these sites from encroachment by farmers, or people would throw garbage in the sites. You know, they became places where kids would hang out and drink. These outsiders moved to protect those areas in many small towns. They weren't only young gay men. High school teachers who were interested in the history of their own towns. Sometimes municipal officials who thought that if they took care of Jewish sites in their towns, it would help bring some tourism to their towns. People who just had a general curiosity about the Jewish community that existed in their cities or towns before the war. They wanted to know more about this very important community that existed before the war. And you have to remember that even though Jews were only 10% of the pre-war population of Poland, they were over 30% of the urban or town population of Poland. So every town, every city had a significant number of Jews, especially in central Poland and southern Poland, former area that was Galicia during the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then parts of Poland going up towards Białystok, towards the northeast. So a big swath of Poland had very significant Jewish population in every city and town before the war. And today, or in the past 15, 20 years, especially since the fall of communism, people in those towns want to know about who was this community that was such an important part of our town. And many of them became interested in protecting the heritage sites, the material culture left over from those communities. So the old-fashioned cameras, when cameras were invented, had a front to hold the lens, a back to hold a piece of film, and a sealed accordion-like bellows which expanded or contracted as the front moved backward or forward to focus. The other advantage of these cameras, which still exist today, is that if you're taking a picture of a building, instead of pointing up the camera, and when you point up the camera, the building looks like it's falling backwards because the verticals converge. With a bellows camera, you can just raise the front. And what the raising of the front does is it takes more of the top of the image, picture of more of the top of the image than the bottom. So you can take a picture of a taller building without it looking like the building is falling backwards. When you raise the front of the camera, all the verticals in the image stay vertical. So that's why architectural photographers use what are called bellows cameras or architectural cameras. Not only can you move the front, you can also move the back and forth, sliding back and forth. And when you move the back and forth, you can capture more of the image. So you can capture 2 or 3 shots and then stitch them together in Photoshop, and that makes a very wide image. So you have 2 or 3 things you can do with an architectural camera with a digital back that you cannot do with a conventional camera. You can photograph architecture where the verticals remain vertical, so it looks proper, and you can use the back to take several shots to stitch together an image that is bigger than you would get just with one shot from your whatever lens you're using. I went back to Poland almost every year for 8 or 9 years. And then in 2016, my wife and I went to Western Ukraine, only Western Ukraine. That's a part of Ukraine that was part of Poland before World War II, and part of it was part of Romania. Chernivtsi was part of Romania. And then we went to the Baltic states in 2016. And then I had some medical issues. I had heart surgery in 2018, so for about 2 years I didn't go anywhere. And then in 2018 and 2019 I planned 2 separate trips to Romania, because in northeast Romania there are 20 beautiful wooden synagogues that are painted. And then in 2020 I arranged the trip again, and then COVID struck. And so I didn't go anywhere for 3.5, 4 years. So that really put an end to that work. So because I felt I couldn't travel, I thought, well, maybe this work is over. And in 2023, I put together a dummy of the book, and I sent it off just on a lark to Figure One Publishing in Vancouver. And they said yes right away, and they published it. In many of these places, the founding Rebbe of a Hasidic sect is buried, often in an ohel, which is a Hebrew word which means small mausoleum. So in places like Sieniawa, Brody, in Ukraine, in Vishnitsia, there are cemeteries which have ohels where the founding Rabbonim, the founding Rebbes of these Hasidic sects are buried, and their disciples from all over the world come to pray at the graveside of the founding rebbes of their sects. And this is all over Poland, and in parts of Ukraine as well. And in a lot of places, the cemeteries are maintained, and people are paid to maintain the cemeteries by these Hasidic groups. So for instance, in the town of Bobova, there's an very old synagogue which has been partially restored, and there's a cemetery on the hill, and the founding Rebbe of the Bobover Hasidim is buried on the hill in that cemetery overlooking Bobova. And his name was Halberstam. And Hasidim from Bobover Hasidim from Israel and from Europe and from North America come several times a year to pray at the graveside of this Rebbe. I don't think most Poles have any problem with religious Haredi Jews visiting sites of their religious ancestors throughout Poland. I don't think they have any problem with it. Even in Ukraine, the town of Uman is very famous as a site of pilgrimage for Haredim from Israel who go visit the gravesite of Reb Nachman of Bratslav. So I don't think they have any problem with it. I think the odd anger or discomfort, I think, is very idiosyncratic and really confined to people who may have other problems or may harbor some anti-Semitic views. But I think in general, they're happy for the tourism. They're happy for people to come and spend money. So the task of preserving Jewish heritage sites throughout Poland and in Ukraine today, and I don't know what's being done in Belarus or in the Baltic states, falls really to people who care about heritage, architecture, or Jews who care about these sites. And I want to point out that all these sites that are restored are not restored exclusively with Jewish money. There is often the World Monuments Fund involved, heritage foundations within Poland or Ukraine, some of them Jewish, some of them not, sometimes municipal or provincial or federal money. Jews don't maintain most of these sites on their own. They need a lot of help in doing so. People have to build coalitions to maintain Jewish heritage sites throughout Eastern Europe. Jews cannot do it on their own. We know that there were organizations that worked very hard to rescue Jews in Poland during the war, but we also know on the flip side that many Poles betrayed their Jewish neighbors. And some even fought against them when Jews were partisans in the woods. Sometimes they would come under fire from Polish partisans. So the record is mixed. But after the fall of communism in Poland, a lot of Poles became interested in the Jewish past of their country, and that produced a lot of positive things. As I explained before, a lot of young people became interested in the Jewish history of Poland. And we see that even on a formal level, on a governmental level, it led to the creation of the Museum Polin, which is an outstanding achievement on its own. So like in every country in Eastern Europe, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It's much better in Poland than in Ukraine, and it's much better in Ukraine today than it was 50 years ago. It's a process. Who could have imagined 10 years ago that we'd see an upsurgence of anti-Semitism in Canada and the United States? And we've had that. So unfortunately, the whole world is not immune from the scourge of anti-Semitism. These things go in cycles, and now we're in an era where anti-Semitism is growing again in many Western countries, and also in some Eastern European countries again. And the task is on all of us to fight against this as much as we can, not only to fight for the well-being of Jews in our societies, but to fight for the well-being of all minority groups in our societies. I traveled to about 50 different locations in Poland and Ukraine and the Baltic states. That's a lot of places. And every place we traveled, you begin to understand that the Holocaust was not directed just from Berlin, but it was a local phenomenon. Everywhere you go, you understand that there were local heroes and local collaborators, people who were willing to turn against their Jewish neighbors to help in their murder or their deportation. And there were some people who helped protect Jews and helped save them. So the Holocaust as a phenomenon was a local phenomenon everywhere it occurred. And it occurred in hundreds and hundreds of locations throughout Eastern Europe, throughout all the places that the Germans occupied during the Second World War. Everywhere you go, there are artifacts of Jewish life. In all these hundreds of places, even if it's an empty field, there may be a cemetery without any matzevot, or there'll be remnants of a synagogue, and people locally will know where those places are. So the task of preserving Jewish artifacts in Eastern Europe is just enormous, it's endless, and the resources available are completely inadequate. So everywhere that some synagogue is restored or a cemetery is saved or restored, it's a miracle. And we should be grateful for those miracles. And my photography and the photography of a few other people who also concern themselves with this subject matter is a sort of cri de coeur. It's a plea for the preservation and activity to preserve what remains of Jewish life in Eastern Europe.